This is a section from Marcel of van der Linden's Western Marxism and the Soviet Union. It's from chapter 3, from Stalin's, quote, Great Leap Forwards, end quote, to the, quote, Great Patriotic War, end quote. And it's about Ryan L. Worrall. It's under the heading of State Capitalism. Okay. The attachment of the label, quote, state capitalist, end quote, to the Soviet Union was not substantively argued for by Myasnikov, Adler, and Wagner. They had simply asserted that the USSR featured surplus value production, capitalist exploitation, etc., but did not provide further arguments to substantiate this interpretation. Unsurprisingly, this weakness was quickly seized upon by the apologists. Footnote. Quote, because one cannot deny that private capitalism does not exist in the Soviet Union, but on the other hand, one cannot affirm that socialism rules there. The only thing that remains is to say that it is state capitalist, end quote. Linden, 1932, end footnote. Towards the end of the 1930s, the theory of state capitalism became gradually more sophisticated in a theoretical sense. In 1939, the American Modern Quarterly published an analysis titled USSR Proletarian or State Capitalist. Its author, Ryan Worrall, who lived from 1903 to 1995, an Australian Trotskyist, endeavored to create a Marxist foundation for the theory of Soviet state capitalism. To emphasize his theoretical orthodoxy, Worall referred to three arguments from the founders of, quote, scientific socialism, end quote. A. In two places in the third volume of Capital, quote, so neglected by students of Karl Marx, end quote, the essence of the capitalist mode of production was defined. Concentration of the means of production in the hands of a small minority of owners, social organization of the labor process, creation of the world market, commodity and surplus value production. Footnote. The references to the following passage from the third volume of Marx's Capital, quote, three cardinal facts about capitalist production. 1. The concentration of the means of production in a few hands, 2. The organization of labor itself as social labor, 3. Establishment of the world market, end quote. Another footnote. The references to the following passage, quote, two characteristic traits mark the capitalist mode of production right from the start. Firstly, it produces its products as commodities, end quote. Marx, end footnote. The second thing that particularly marks the capitalist mode of production is the production of surplus value as the direct object and decisive motive of production, end quote. B. In his analysis of share capital, also in Volume 3 of Capital, Marx had shown that in joint stock companies, the managers of enterprises became, quote, directors, end quote, of the capital of others, while those supplying the capital only retained an ownership title. In this way, capital as private property was, quote, abolished, end quote, within the boundaries of the capitalist mode of production itself. Footnote. The references to the following passage, quote, 3. Formation of joint stock companies. Through this, 2. It is the abolition of capitals as private property within the confines of the capitalist mode of production itself. 3. Transformation of the actual functioning capitalist into a mere manager, in charge of other people's capital, and of the capital owner into a mere owner, a mere money capitalist, end quote. Marx, end footnote. C. In Anti-Düring, Engels had not only anticipated the growth of share capital, but also the tendency to leave investments too large for private entrepreneurs, for example, in the railways sector, to the state to organize. Both developments did not imply the disappearance of capitalism, according to Engels, but the capital relation was not abolished by it, but only intensified. Footnote. The reference is especially to the following passage, quote, "The modern state, no matter what its form, is essentially a capitalist machine, the state of the capitalists, the ideal personification of the total national capital. The more it proceeds to the taking over of productive forces, the more does it actually become the national capitalist. The more citizens does it exploit. The workers remain wage workers, proletarians. The capitalist relation is not done away with, it rather is brought to a head," end quote. Engels. End footnote. From A, Worall concluded that private ownership, specifically of means of production, did not have to be an essential feature of capitalism, quote, "in every phase of capitalism's development," end quote. From B, and especially from C, Worall deduced that, quote, "the further development of capitalism in the direction of state ownership of the means of production," end quote, could lead to, quote, "the virtual abolition of private property," end quote, while the essence of capitalism remained the same. With his appeal to the classics, Worall appears to have wanted to prove in particular that a society in which state and capital fused in one dominating totality was a theoretical possibility within the tradition of scientific socialism. Lenin was also cited in this context as witness. The next step in Worrall's argument aimed to make a credible case for the view that the theoretical possibility had become a reality in the Soviet Union, that a historically unique fusion of economic and political centers of power had really occurred on a capitalist basis. Worrall's theorems in this regard can be summarized as follows. 1. The Stalinist bureaucracy was not a bourgeois class. The Stalinist bureaucracy's structure, after all, did not show any similarity with the bourgeoisie based on private property. 2. Nevertheless, the function of the bureaucracy was identical to the function of the bourgeoisie. Quote, "Its social aim, objectively speaking, is the accumulation of capital in Russia, the production of commodities, the extraction of surplus value from the working class, the realization of this surplus value as profits of the state, and the conversion of profits into further state property, especially capital in the form of further means of production, more factories, more machinery, more mines, etc." End quote. Worall. 3. The Soviet Union would be a worker state if the bureaucracy was subordinate to the working class, that is to say, if the Soviets or other forms of workers' democracy governed the policy of the bureaucracy. This, however, was not the case, and, quote, "precisely that fact makes the Russian state a capitalist instead of a workers' state," end quote. 4. The Soviet system did not export capital and exploited no colonies. The Soviet system was therefore not imperialist, though the Soviet system was capitalist. 5. The Soviet system was closer to socialism than ordinary capitalism. The Soviet system formed, quote, "a transition stage in which the principle of private property has been abolished, and the means of production are withheld from proletarian control only by a precariously placed bureaucracy," end quote. Worall. 6. Soviet capitalism was able to develop from the proletarian October Revolution because from approximately 1923, a violent counter-revolution had occurred, quote, "spread over a decade," end quote. This counter-revolution was possible because of a combination of objective factors, economic and cultural backwardness, the influence of the world market and capitalist ideology, and a subjective factor, namely a level of resistance by Trotsky and others during the crucial years of 1923 to 29, which had been too weak, end quote. Worall. No, that's not a quote, sorry. It's the end of a, sorry. It's not a quote, that's van der Linden. It's just indented, so never mind. Although Worrall's argumentation to some extent recalled the views of Korish, creeping counter-revolution, Worrall's contribution is innovative insofar as Worrall was apparently the first to use the concept of state capitalism not just as a descriptive label, but also analytically. For Worrall, the distinction between a worker state and an accumulation regime rested only on who held political power. A capitalist accumulation regime, he considered, could also be in the interest of the working class, if the working class itself had decided on the capitalist exploitation of itself. The end.